Okay, this video is for a tune-up of a casement window. I think this is a Karadko, but I think this procedure is going to be the same. Now, what I noticed was on this casement window, which was from 1984, almost 40 years old, this crank was starting to make some noise. It would have what I would call a rough spot on it. And that is by comparison with this one, which didn't have that characteristic. You know, it seemed to work fine. Now, I would say that this one probably could use some lubrication on the slides, but I didn't get the feeling that there was a problem. It does have a certain amount of backlash in here, but that doesn't actually seem to affect the operation. So, but this one, it was starting to make that type of noise that I would describe as maybe the metal rubbing against the metal inside here. I thought I needed to grease this or something like that. So anyway, first step was, how do I do that? How do I get this out? Well, I did notice one thing. I noticed that there was a little screw on the handle. I was able to take the handle off, but I discovered that didn't really lead me anywhere. This handle came off, but the gears, that the splines on this handle were perfectly fine. I noticed also this one was quite wobbly by comparison with this one. Now this one has a little bit of a wobble, but not like this one did. This one had more. It has a lot now because I've actually disassembled this, and I'm just going to show you. Now this one you'll see, notice how this cover piece on the top is actually prying up. Now the reason for that is it was nailed down with brads, and over the years those brads have pulled through, and now they're actually preventing this from sitting flat. And this was just like that. And I kind of, after looking on the internet, saw some hints about the way to remove this, and you've got to remove the trim piece that's over it. Now it was held in with brads. The brads had already pulled through. So what I did was I just got a drill bit and I just pried it up because it was up anyway, and then I drilled down, and I was able to pry it up enough so that the drill didn't actually interfere with these brads. But then I noticed that there were actually some brads on the two ends also. I could detect those by running like a putty knife, a flat putty knife underneath, and it would hit an object right there. And if I looked very carefully from the side, I could actually see that there was an object protruding there. Now, rather than try to drill a hole around these things, because I wasn't getting any luck in that regard, because I could not pry this up enough so the drill bit could go through the wood without interfering with the brad, what I did instead was take a nail set and drive these brads right straight through. If I'd done that in the middle, it would have been a little bit nicer, because the hole from the nail set will be a lot easier to patch than these. My original thought was to replace these with screws, in which case these holes would not be a problem. The idea that if this is a trim plate for something that is serviceable, it should come off. It shouldn't be nailed down with brads such that you can't remove it. Okay, now once you take those out, I was able to slide this out. There's nothing else holding it except that. Like I mentioned, I've already done that. Once you do that, you get access to these screws, and you can take this mechanism out. Okay? Now, once I took this mechanism out, I looked at it. It did not look half bad. But what I did do is I cleaned it out, and then I packed. This has like an Archimedean type screw on this one, and it engages with this, and that's how it opens. And in order to prevent those gears from wearing any more than necessary, I took some bearing grease and I packed it into this cavity right here. The reason I did that is because when this is in place and the window is open, that cavity is exposed to the elements. Now, normally when it's raining, you would have the window closed, but that's not always the case. Thunderstorm, and just over 40 years, you're going to get stuff getting in there. In my case, most of it was insects. spiders or whatever that go into that cavity. It's full of dust and dirt. Well, so I cleaned it out. I packed that with grease. My thought was, I'm just going to keep this screw mechanism from wearing down, whereas I felt that I was getting some metal on metal, and it was probably compensating for the fact that the window was not sliding as easily as it could. But those two factors together, you know, you want to add lubrication at every possible point. In here, I want to add grease. I want to keep moisture out, anything out from getting in there. And that grease, I don't think is going to actually do any harm at that location because you never handle anything, okay, in there. Now I'll just hit pause and I'll reassemble this, okay, and I'll show you. First thing I'm going to do is just put these 4 screws in, okay. I did find that this was rocking because these screws were loose, and it did overall increase the feeling of sloppiness in the whole mechanism. So let me just hit pause. Okay, those 4 screws went in fine, and those threads were in good shape. And this now does not rock at all from any looseness in that base. And over 40 years, wood screws will loosen up like that, especially on something like this where you're constantly, daily cranking it open and closed, and you're putting pressure on it. And once the threads get loose, they will strip out if you don't snug them up, which is why I think this really needs to be serviceable. This should not be put in with a brad there, although it seemed to work okay. Now the next step on this, you probably already know this, is that there's a little hole, there's a spot here where this can fit underneath into, it's got a little semicircular cutout, and that allows that to fit in, okay? And then it's engaged, and then once it's engaged, now on this particular window, it doesn't go completely smooth because as I'm closing it, I get to a point where there's a very slight binding, okay? And you can see here that it does pinch the gasket. This one might be pinching the gasket, but I can tell that when it closes in, I don't notice any of that pinching. And I suspect that this window has sagged a little bit. And I did take a look at it, but I didn't find an easy way to deal with it. So I think that this will be okay. The gasket might not last forever, but it still seems okay. And I'm just going to monitor this. I'll see how this works out. It could work out fine. I did try playing with trying to lift this up a little bit so it wouldn't pinch, because the pinching is happening because of this. But the problem is I can't really lift this up. I tried prying this a little bit so that the angle was a little bit more than 90 degrees to pull up on this, because this is captive and that would pull it up. But the problem with that is when I did that, after I did that, then I had a problem, because as I was operating the window, when it would get to the midpoint, it would pop down, because by prying that up, I created pressure between the control rod here and that guide. So that was a no-no. Anyway, so I had to pry that back down into position. I think this is fine now. And I'm going to have to do something with this plate in the way along the lines of getting some screws to hold this in. Now these brads, I'm going to have to actually I'll probably just fill these and use the 2 screws in the middle, because I use the nail set to set those brads down, and I can't put a screw in this same spot. Okay, anyway, it doesn't have the rougher sound that I was getting in there. So probably I just had some dirt or something that had gotten into that screw mechanism, and I didn't like the sound of it. Now I still have a little tight spot, but I think it's fine. So